Good morning, New Hope. Glad to see you this morning. Glad that you're here. I'm Clint Wood. I'm one of the pastors here, and we're so glad that you're here today as we continue on with our sermon series of Paul. And this is our third week of talking about Paul, and so we're real excited about even next week. We're going to invite you back next week as we're really going to look into Paul's life and even that calling that God has for us. But to kind of recap the last 2 weeks, the first week we looked at Paul, and we began to say, as we look at this guy, how God used him in so many ways. Even when you look in the New Testament, he wrote most of the New Testament. And many times we look at this and we think, how could I ever measure up to that? But one thing that Paul tells us, he goes, I'm a sinner, which as a matter of fact, I am the worst of sinners. And here's the thing, he grew up as a Pharisee. He hated Jesus and his followers. But his life changed drastically when one day he had a crossroads and had an experience with Jesus that changed his life forever. From that point forward, he began to preach and teach, but that led from one change to another. And last week we talked about change. And change is so difficult for all of us. None of us like change. We like things the way that they are. But all the changes that Paul had to go through, that God was working in him, that even maybe some of you are going through things right now, you think, why is God doing this? God's doing a work in you, preparing you for the calling he has for your life. And so we're so excited this morning. We're going to be talking about the missionary journeys of Paul. And he took these 3 missionary journeys, and we're going to talk more about that. But before we do, I just have one thing I want to share with all of you. We're really excited. We actually have hired a new student pastor. And so Brian and Lisa C., you can see this picture right here. This is Brian and Lisa C. They're from Oregon City, and so they will be joining our staff in August. He'll be overseeing all of our student ministry over middle school, but he will be specifically working with the high schoolers and also college age. It's so important that we have a college ministry with a new college coming into town. And so we're really excited about Brian and Lisa joining us in August. So if you'll be praying for them as they're going to be moving here, praying for us, but we are really excited. I want to let you know what's going on with that. But today we're going to continue on with our series. And I have to tell you this, I'm actually not the one that's going to be bringing the message today. Fresh off a plane from Israel, right? We have Pastor Brandon is going to come. So help me welcome Pastor Brandon this morning. Or should I call you Rabbi Brandon?
Yeah, Rabbi, yeah.
Right,
Shalom. Hey, it's really good to be here with you guys, and I'm excited. I'm going to share a little bit about Paul and his missionary journeys, but before I do, I thought I would just tease those of you who have never been to Israel with just some pictures. Shall we do that? You want to see the trip? It's pretty incredible. If you haven't been, I had high expectations, and they were shattered. I mean, someone said when you go there, it feels like you're home. Like I've never been there, but I felt familiar because you've read about all of these cities and these stories and these places where Jesus walked and ministered, and now I'm standing at them, and I'm looking at them, and I'm praying and reading the story at the site. I mean, I can't explain to you how incredible that is. So I'm just going to tease you a little bit as we go through and look at some of these pictures. So this is one of the first places we went, and that probably doesn't mean anything to you. This was one of my favorite spots. This is called the Precipice of Nazareth. It's a hill right outside of Nazareth. This is where Jesus grew up. This was his backyard. So Jesus would often, more than likely, he would climb this hill and as a small boy and look out, and this is what he would see. And behind him is his home. In front of him is this huge valley. And then to the left, you can't see this on here, but to the left is Mount Carmel, the ranges where Elijah fought Baal. And Jesus grew up looking at those mountains. I mean, it's unbelievable how close everything is and how it all relates when you're there. This is me in front of the city of Dan. That is the gate that Abraham walked through 5,000 years ago. That's how old that is, just mud gate. They can't even open it because it'll collapse on itself. But it's incredible. So Abraham walked up those steps and into the city of Dan. Isn't that incredible? This is just a fun picture of me and some Israeli friends that I made. It's always good to make friends with the guys with the guns, so if anything happens, they're everywhere. This is just a park. There's some guys playing soccer down there. This is called the Valley of Henna, or, ready for this, Gar Henna. Gehenna, that is the word for hell. That, my friends, is hell. Looks beautiful, right? Isn't that great? If you go down, it's actually a burial yard. Like there's a bunch of tombs in there, and this would have been in Jesus' day where they threw all the trash and was kind of a dump. It doesn't look so dumpy now. It's kind of nice. But when that place freezes over, hell officially freezes over. So that's interesting. This is Jericho. This is where the walls came. That is the actual walls that came tumbling down. So the mud in front here, you can see that's the second. So there's two walls, a stone wall and a mud wall. The mud wall fell forward and created a ramp for them to go in. That is it right there. Isn't that incredible? That's Jericho. This is where it happened. This is one of my favorite spots. These are the caves of Qumran and the Dead Sea. This is where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you know anything about the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were the greatest archaeological find in biblical history. And these are them, so that you can kind of see there's caves. There's a ton of caves in this whole area. They found scrolls in 11 of the caves. We hiked up to Cave 1, the very first cave that they found. And this is not a tourist spot. Our guide was an archaeologist, so he's like, hey, you guys want to just go check out some sites? So we're like hopping fences, and it's legal here. What are they going to do, arrest me now? So we're trespassing this technically. And we go in, and he's like, this is the first cave where they found the Isaiah scrolls. He goes, there's probably been 40 people total in this cave in its history. You guys want to go in? And we're like, are you kidding me? He's like, just archaeologists and like those who are studying, those are the only ones who go in this cave. It's not a tourist spot. So here's what it looks like. This is the cave going in. It's not very large. He goes, hey, just be careful. There's some bats in there. And we're like, what? So this is the cave. There's about 5 or 6 of us in there, and that's it. And they found these Dead Sea Scrolls from this group called the Essenes, who stored them in there to keep them out of the sun, keep them safe. And then it was just forgotten. They left the city of their area of Qumran and never to return. And then 2,000 years later, they find and they found every book of the Old Testament except for Ruth. So they found all these Old Testament scriptures in these caves, and there's 11 of them. This is the western wall. This is one of the few remaining walls of the original temple 2,000 years ago. This is one of the more holy sites in Jerusalem. So you can see a bunch of people praying at the wall. They're putting notes in the wall. Here's kind of a close-up of what it looks like. It's huge. And this is just a small portion of the wall. The wall continues 1,600 feet. Our guide said that you could fit 22 football fields inside the old city. I mean, it's just massive, the size of this structure. It was the largest structure in the world at that 2,000 years ago. It was the largest structure in the world. This is fun. This is just a buddy that saw me taking pictures, and so he said, hey, can you take a picture of my kindergarten class in front of the wall? I'm like, oh, absolutely, because you never question a man with a very large sidearm. This is a rabbi who's and so like one of the questions that comes up, do you feel safe? Oh, absolutely. I mean, nobody does anything there because it is such a strong deterrent. If you do anything, you got about like 3 seconds to live, because there are a bunch of it feels extremely safe. As crazy as that sounds, never did I fear for my life at all. It is really an incredible experience. And if you haven't gone, I encourage you, if you ever have an opportunity to do so, to take it. I think I have a few more. This is one of my favorite spots. So these are the actual steps that Jesus walked to get up to the temple. So there's a gate. It's called the southern gate or the south gate. It is the gate that all the common people went through to get to the temple. So these steps, like this actual path, these steps, these are the steps his parents walked to dedicate him to the temple. These are the steps he went up to change the money changers' tables. These are the steps Paul walked. Literally, Paul walked up. So the gate's right there. It's closed in now. You can kind of see the top of the arch. These are the steps that Paul walked up when he went to the temple. I mean, it is unbelievable being there and realizing these steps are thousands of years old, and the amount of people. There's a goofy guy in front of him that walked up these is incredible. So I just sat down there, and we're reading the story of Jesus going to the temple, and it's just like, this is it. Like, you walked right up here. It is an incredible experience. If you ever have the opportunity to go, do anything and everything you can to take it. Start saving money now, because it is. I truly believe, like, if you want to, like, grow your faith, you want to have a better understanding of Scripture, you just got to go visit the Holy Land. It is unbelievable. You see how things connect, and we're on a boat in the Sea of Galilee. Like, yeah, no big deal. I'm just sailing the Sea of Galilee today. And you look over and you see Capernaum, where Peter lived, and where Jesus. You see the shore where Jesus called Peter, and he says, "Hey, Peter, come be a fisherman." Right? That happened right there. And then you look over, and at like a 3-minute walk, there's the Mount of Beatitudes, and you see where Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount. It's this beautiful hill. It's not so much a mount as it is just a hill, and it's unbelievable. And then you scan over a few more like minutes of a walk, and there's where he encountered the demon-possessed man with the 2,000 demons, and he cast them out. Like, that happened right there. And then you scan over a little, and there's the city of Tiberias. So it was kind of like the hub, and where the Pharisees were. And all of a sudden, it all just like darts start connecting, and it makes sense, and you start to realize, wow, this is unbelievable. You read these names in the Bible, and you read cities, and you read, and then when you see them, you start to realize, oh my gosh, this makes sense. I can picture these things happening because I know the scenery. So again, commercial over. But if you ever have a chance to go to Israel, do it. I think, as shameless plug, I think Pastor Randy's actually doing a group next year, and if you're interested, we might have info about it in the Connection Center, but it really is a phenomenal experience. Leave the kids behind and just go. It is great. But today we're talking about Paul, and I'll share a little bit more about one of the sites we visited. We visited probably over 40 sites, but one of them was a site that Paul had experience in, and so I'll share that in a second. But some background about Paul, and specifically his missionary journey. So week one, Pastor Clint talked about his past and where this guy Paul or Saul came from, and his upbringing, and the kind of person he was. Last week, about the change and the transformation he saw in his life. Today we talk about what he did because of that change. And he went on 3 different missionary journeys, and then a 4th journey that wasn't so much a missionary journey, but it was a journey to Rome under arrest. And so we'll talk about that a little bit as well. So his first missionary journey, he traveled 1,400 miles in 2 years. You have, I think, room in your notes to write some of this down. In the back, in the Connection Center, there's this paper as well. This has a ton of, if you're interested at all, this has a ton of info about his missionary journeys. You can pick it up on your way out as well. So he traveled for 2 years, 1,400 miles by land, by sea. He traveled with a few guys, Barnabas and John Mark, and then if you know the story, they had a falling out over John Mark. They traveled throughout Galatia. Galatia was a region, and so they traveled starting churches, visiting churches in Galatia. And then he wrote Galatians while he was in Antioch, one of the stops on this trip. So his first missionary journey, he writes the book of Galatians. It's one of the earliest books he wrote. And here's a map. Here's a map of the first journey, so you can see kind of where he traveled. It looks like a lot there, but compared to his other journeys, this is just kind of a minor. This is just round one, right? 1,400 miles, 2 years. This is just the beginning of Paul's missionary journeys. So you see him kind of traveling out throughout Galatia, and then back to his home base, and then back into Antioch. That's Paul's first missionary journey. He takes a second missionary journey a few years later, and he travels 2,800 miles in 3 years. He travels with a different set of guys. He travels with Silas, Timothy, a married couple, Priscilla and Aquila, and Luke, which is where we get a lot of this info from. Luke was actually there and wrote, and so he wrote the book of Acts and wrote about the travels of Paul because he was there for some of it. He visited some sites he visited that you might recognize: Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, Corinth, Ephesus, Caesarea, which is an important one we'll talk about in a second, and then and Jerusalem. So those are just a few of the sites that the churches that he visited. He wrote books to a number of those, or epistles they're called, letters to them, to the churches in a number of those. He wrote, and then on this journey he wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians while he was in Corinth. And so he wrote it to the church in Thessalonica while he had visited there, and now he's in Corinth, and he's writing a letter. I just need to write to them. So all of the letters of Paul have a historical point in time where he's writing to them at a specific instance in his life. And so the second missionary journey looks like this. He traveled, he covered far more distance and went throughout Asia, went up to Macedonia, went up to Corinth and Athens and Greece, and then Ephesus, and made his way back. He finally landed in a place called Caesarea, and then traveled to Jerusalem, and that was by land. That's his second journey, so it gets a little bit larger. Paul's third missionary journey, he travels 2,700 miles in 4 years. So each one he takes a little bit longer, a little bit there's more to do. He stays longer in each site because he's building relationships with these churches. He traveled with a guy named Timothy, who he wrote a couple letters to, 1st and 2nd Timothy. He wrote, and then he traveled with Luke and then a few others. He visited Galatia, Ephesus, Corinth, Macedonia, Philippi, again, Caesarea, and Jerusalem. So he visited kind of some of the same sites he went on his journey to. He said, I'm going to go back and visit them, see how the churches are doing. And then when you read his letters, you see him writing, hey, I've been meaning to come visit you, and I'm so excited to see that you're thriving, that your church is growing, or some that by now you should have some spiritual maturity. You should be eating meat, but you're still on milk. What's going on here? You guys should be growing more in your faith. And you see these come out in his letters. He wrote 1st and 2nd Corinthians while in Ephesus and in Macedonia. And then he wrote Romans, the book of Romans, while he was in Corinth on his third missionary journey. It's getting later towards the end of his life. His entire ministry span was about 30 years, and so he's been traveling for now about 10 to 12 of these years. And so here's what his third journey looks like. Again, it's just this big loop. It's a ton of miles that he's covering. And here, hold on now. Here we go. There's the third one. I apologize. So he kind of double back. So he goes up through Macedonia and then comes back through again and ends up landing again at Caesarea and at Jerusalem. And that's where he ends his third missionary journey, in Jerusalem. About 5 days go by, and he starts facing some persecution. He gets arrested. They transport him to Caesarea for safety. He's in Caesarea, and here's some pictures. So this is one of the sites we visited. So this is the ancient city of Caesarea. You see some of the columns there from the palace of Herod. He had this built. It's right on the sea. It was one of the largest ports in the Mediterranean, in that area. This is called a hippodrome. This is where they did chariot races, gladiator fights. I mean, this was entertainment. This was the place to be. If you've seen movies like Ben-Hur, like Gladiator, they happen. It recites just like this. This was the theater. This was a huge building or a structure, and there was actually a third level that collapsed, so it went up even further. The black chairs and the pipe and drape stuff, that was not original. But there would have been a massive stone wall there with a background. They would do plays and art and drama. They would have speakers come. If there was no internet, there was no mail, there were no phones, so the way they communicated to people was through drama. So they put together a play about a war and Caesar and how he won his war, this battle or this fight, or Caesar makes a decree, and the way to get the word out was through drama. So they would actually pay people in the cities to come see these dramas, these plays, because that's how they communicated all the way from Rome. They communicated to people through drama. And so this was one of the sites. This is probably, maybe potentially, one of the places where Paul actually got up on that stage and spoke and gave a defense as to why he was being wrongfully imprisoned. So he gets called in by a guy named Felix and then another guy named Festus, and he's essentially saying, why are these Jews saying you should be arrested? Why do they want to kill you? Because they want to stone him and they want to put him in jail. And they give us a defense. And this is probably the place, because it was the public square. It was where ideas came, and someone had a new God to worship. They would come and share here, and everyone would listen and ooh, ah. And so this may have been a place where Paul actually gave a defense for himself that we read in Scripture in the book of Acts. Again, there's the goofy guy in front of it. This is the port, what it looks like today. It's hard to tell the scale of it, but it is quite large. This is the water that Paul actually sailed into when he landed in Caesarea. This is the spot. This is where he would have pulled up his boat, got off a number of times, both second and third missionary journey. He traveled to and from Caesarea. This is the spot. You're here and you're just thinking, what would it have been like 2,000 years ago? And there's Paul, Timothy getting off a boat, going to walk in. I mean, it's just unbelievable. The water back then would have gone up further. Since then, there's been a lot that's been built out, and there's like a little shopping mall kind of out there. But this is the original spot that the water would have hit. And so that's our guide there. And he was, most likely, this is probably the spot Paul docked. One of these spots. There's a few of these along it's grass now, but it would have been water. Who knows? This may have been where Paul got off and walked up those steps and walked into Caesarea. It is incredible. Here's what the city would have looked like with the port, and you see the theater down at the bottom here. You see the palace where the columns were, and then up a little bit further, you see the hippodrome, the big chariot racing area, and then you see the boats in the harbor. So Paul, on his journey up from Jerusalem, was under arrest, and then he was taken to Caesarea. The king there decided that there's no reason to hold Paul. He's innocent of his charges of trying to create a rebellion. Clearly he's not. But it says he feared the Jews and wanted to appease them, so he left Paul in prison. He left him awaiting his trial for 2 years. So Paul is stuck in this city in jail for 2 years while he's just simply awaiting his trial. He's not even found guilty. He's just waiting for it. That king dies, another one comes and takes over, and one of the first things he does is, this isn't right, we got to do the trial. And so 2 years later, he calls Paul out, and that's when he gives his defense, and then he says, I find no reason to keep this guy, but the Jews wanted to stone him, and so it is in this place where Paul makes the famous, he says, well then, as a Roman citizen, I appeal to Caesar. Maybe you remember that in the story. And at that moment, they say, wait, what is this guy doing? Essentially, an equivalent for us is he's saying, I want my case to go to the Supreme Court because I'm not getting a fair trial. And so I appeal to Caesar. And so they say, well, to Caesar you go then. If to Caesar you appeal, then to Caesar you go. And you read in the commentary, it says that they're kind of talking amongst themselves, and they say, if this guy had not appealed to Caesar, he would have been let go. He would have been freed. But he appeals to Caesar, so then he awaits for a boat to come to transport him all the way up to Rome. He leaves from this city. He spent a lot of time here under arrest, under threat of those who wanted to persecute him. Caesarea is a really incredible place. It's one of the largest archaeological sites that is in Israel right now. It's been excavated. Herod, for being an awful guy, he built a lot of cool stuff. The final journey, or it's not really a missionary journey, but from Caesarea then he travels to Rome, and he travels 2,250 miles. He traveled with the Roman guards, and then they allow him to travel with Luke and a few others of his friends. He started in Jerusalem, then he goes to Caesarea, Crete, Malta, where he is in the shipwreck, and then he gets washed up on the island. He gets bitten by the snake on Malta, and then the venomous snake, and he doesn't die. And so they start to worship him. He says, no, I'm just a man. That happened on Malta. And then he finally ends in Rome. He wrote Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians while in Rome. While in Rome, he waits another 2 years for Caesar to hear his case. So he's just been in prison and jail for 4 years, just awaiting for someone to hear his case. Not found guilty, just waiting. Here's the final map, the final journey of Paul. You see him go up through there, up through the Mediterranean Sea. He gets a shipwreck, he lands on Malta, and then he ends up in Rome. That's the background, the overview of Paul's missionary journeys. It's pretty extensive. We can spend so much time on each one because of all of the incredible sites and the stuff he wrote and all of the things that happen. But for the sake of today, we're just going to ask a few questions on okay, so great. That was a great history lesson, right? Someone earlier said, I really like maps. And I said, well, we got maps for you today. Like, great, so what? That was wonderful. I see that Paul did a lot of traveling. I, too, have, traveled a lot. We go visit Yellowstone, and we visit, we like to travel. Okay. Well, here's some questions. And we're going to look at Paul's life, but question number one is what keeps, specifically for, what keeps you up at night? What are the things that you worry about in life? What are the things that you struggle with, that maybe you and your wife pray about, or you think about, or it wakes you up in the middle of the night and you just can't get that thought out of your mind? And it may be retirement, it may be a child, it may be if you're in school, it may be that test, it may be a child who's maybe wandered away from the faith, it may be a job interview. What keeps you up? What is it that seems to overtake your thought life and just kind of is just always there? For Paul, there was really one thing that kept him up. There's one thing that the reason he did all of these trips, and we'll look at what he suffered through. And he says this in Romans chapter 9. He says this: I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. For I could wish that I myself were cursed, and listen to this, and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, those of my own race, the people of Israel. Paul says, I have a deep burden. I have a pain in my heart for the Jews, for those of my own race, the people of Israel. I would rather give up my salvation that they may have it. I would rather be cut off from Jesus if that meant they got to know him. It doesn't happen that way, but that's how much of a burden I have for my people and how much I know they need Jesus. It would be hard for us to compete or to compare our burdens with Paul, but it does beg the question, does this keep us up at night? Do those in our own family keep us up at night? Do we have a burden for those in our neighborhood, in our streets, parents of our kids on our soccer team or at school, or our own siblings maybe, or our own parents or our kids? Like, do we have such a strong burden that we will do whatever it takes, whenever, and for however long it takes? For Paul, you could see this kept him up at night. Should I do another missionary journey? Oh, it's a lot of work. You know what? What choice do I have? I have to. And so the first question for us really is, what keeps us up at night? What do we put our emotional energy into? If we were to write down a list of the things, just kind of whatever you think at night, I would, myself included, I would venture to say most of it is temporary stuff. Most of it is maybe for next week or maybe next year, or things that really of eternal consequence aren't that high on the totem pole. But what would change if we started to have and we said, I need a burden. God, break my heart for those in my neighborhood, for my friends who don't know, for my coworkers who don't know you. And I know it's super weird and awkward to share Jesus, to share you at work. But I think Paul would say, you have to. What choice do you have? What choice do you have? What's the worst they can do to you? Kill you and beat you? He's like, I've got all that. We're going to look at in a second what he suffered through. And he's like, I've done all that. What else? There's nothing they can do that will prevent me from wanting people to know Jesus. The next question, and this is maybe a harder one. If you were the only Christian in this city, wherever you live, Bend, Redmond, Lapine, Sun River, wherever you may be, if you were the only Christian in that city, we'll just say Bend. If you were the only Christian in Bend, do you think you would remain faithful to Jesus? Is your faith and devotion to Jesus strong enough that you can withstand being the only follower of Jesus in a city? That's a hard question, right? I mean, we don't know that, and we won't ever know that because just look around. There's at least this many in Bend. And so we know that, okay, I'll never be alone. But if you were, is your faith so strong and so you have such a strong conviction that you can withstand that? Listen to what Paul says. Here's the things that he went through and he suffered through a lot of times just by himself, all for the sake of the cross. He says, 5 times I received from the Jews for the 40 lashes minus 1. 40 was deemed to kill someone, so they'd say, hey, go 40 minus 1. You get 39. One more will kill you. We'll let you go 30. He's like, 5 times that happened to me. I got all the scars to prove it. He says, 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. He was stoned and left for dead. Like he was 3 times I was shipwrecked. Well, not once. That wasn't enough. Not 2. 3 different. I mean, he's getting on the wrong boats, right? I mean, 3 times he's shipwrecked. He's not done. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my own countrymen, the Jews, in danger from the Gentiles, everyone else. And then he says, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false brothers. Whew, Paul, man, this is a list of suffering. I have labored and toiled and often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. And besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. So more than all of that is this weight, this burden, this thing that keeps me, this stress that keeps me up at night for all the churches and for all those who are trying to follow Jesus. And so he's visiting them all because he has this burden for them. Who is weak? And I do not feel weak. He said that those who are weak, brother, I feel it. I empathize with them. Who is led into sin, and I do not inwardly burn. It's personal. All these things and what happens at these churches are deeply personal to Paul. He suffered a lot, and he often did it alone. And we look at Paul as a man of great faith. But you know what? And Paul would say the same. If he was here now, he would say the same thing. He would say, guys, I'm just a man. I'm not some angel. I'm not some heavenly saint. I'm a person, just like you. I have struggles just like you. I had issues growing up just like you. I have conflicts in my heart just like you. I've done things that I'm not proud of just like you. But he had an incredible faith that suffered through a lot. So if you were the only Christian in this city, would you remain faithful? Is your faith strong enough that you would say, I would go through that. Shipwreck, great, that's fine. The 40 lashes minus 1, okay, for Jesus, all right, let's do it. That's a hard commitment to say, yeah, I'll do that. You want to get stoned? We'll just stand here, we'll all throw rocks at you? No thanks. Paul was, for the sake of the cross, I'll do it. For me to live as Christ and die as gain. So if they kill me, great. If not, I'm going to keep living for Jesus. Here's the last question. What does sharing Jesus with others look like in your context? You're probably not going to get on a ship and travel the Mediterranean and go on these grand missionary journeys for 2, 3, 4 years at a time. You're probably not going to go and start planning churches and travel and being arrested and beaten and persecuted and getting whipped and beat by rods and stuff. That's probably not going to happen to you. But that doesn't mean we're off the hook from sharing Jesus. That doesn't mean that we just say, you know what, Paul did all that, I don't have to. I don't need to share my faith. What is sharing Jesus? If you have this burden for people to come to know Jesus because eternity is at stake, what does it look like in your context to share Jesus with others? And it's going to be different for every one of us. Some of us are in contexts where it is really hard to share your faith. Because even as a professional, it's looked down upon. It might cost you business. It might cost you your job. So you got to be a little more as shrewd as serpents, as Jesus would say. But we still are called to share our faith. Some of us, it might be easier. For myself, it's not hard. My struggle is having people that don't know Jesus to talk to, right? Because I hang out with Christians all day. And you guys are nice, but, but I'd like some non-Christians in my life. And so for me, it's meeting parents in my kids' sports teams. It's meeting parents at school. It's making connections outside of church. That's my missionary journey right now. With my neighbors who don't know Jesus, building connections. Listen to what Paul says. This was his strategy on how he did this. He says this in 1 Corinthians, though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To win as many as possible. I will do whatever it takes to see as many people in heaven as possible. So that when I get there, there is a great host of people that would say, thank you for being faithful. Thank you for being faithful, Paul. Thank you for sharing at great personal expense because I'm here because of you. To the Jews, I become like the Jews, like a Jew to win the Jews. And then he says, to those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law. He said, those who live strictly by the law, all right, I'll enter the conversation in that arena, though I'm not burdened by the law itself. So as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law. He's like, for the Gentiles who don't have the Jewish laws and customs, I become like them. Though I am not free from God's law, but I'm under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I become weak. To win the weak, I have become all things to all men, so that by all possible means, I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Paul is saying, I will literally put my life on the line and do whatever it takes to see people come to know Jesus, as many people as possible. And I would argue that Jesus is asking no less of us, to do whatever it takes to see as many people come to know Jesus as possible. And it's going to look different in each of our contexts. But it does call for action. It does call for more than, I don't want to offend really, but it does call for more than, I'll just be a good example. Paul's good example was suffering for Jesus and actually telling people about him. And suffering for it. And so for us, we'll ask the question again. What does sharing Jesus with others look like in your context? What does it mean for you to be on a missionary journey for the rest of your life? What does it look like on your neighborhood, with your friends, with your family, to say, to in your head, I have a burden to see as many people as possible come to know Jesus by any means necessary. What will that look like? And personally, I know this will happen, but I'm trying to limit as much as possible. When I die and go to heaven and we're all there, I want as little regret as possible. I don't ever want to say, I wish I had shared Jesus with so-and-so, but I was scared. I was nervous. I didn't think I knew enough, so I didn't want to. They would ask a question that would stump me, so I just didn't bring it up. Personally, just get a little. My grandmother passed away a few years ago, and she was a Mormon, heavily in the Mormon church, and I knew she was dying, and I didn't make an effort to go and be with and to share Jesus, to share my faith. Not that it would have maybe done a thing, but I carry that burden of regret to say I didn't do everything I could to see as many people come to know Jesus as possible. And I would hate, I would hate to get to heaven and see a whole bunch more of those stories, or so and so would have been here, could have been here, or you remember Schindler's List, the movie? We actually visited his grave where it's over there in Israel. And he says at the end, he said, all these people, of all these lives he saved, and he breaks down, he says, I could have done more. So this watch, I could have sold this watch. This could have been 2 more people. These glasses, I could have saved 1 more. And for him, it was never enough. And I pray, God, that you would burden me with that same passion. That there are always more people who need Jesus. And so if we learn anything from Paul's missionary journeys, it is about a man who had a deep conviction and was willing to suffer so that others could know Jesus. And I believe he's calling us to the same thing. Let me pray for us as we end. And I want you, as we pray, just to be thinking about, even in your life, what does this kind of faith look like for me? What does this kind of burden look like for me? That I am so concerned with people knowing Jesus that I am willing to suffer whatever the consequences. Whatever it may be. Let me pray for us. God, thank you for men like Paul. Thank you for your word. Thank you for a man who was faithful to the end, who says, I am running the race as to win the prize. And at the end of his life, he says, I've finished the race. I've done what you've asked me to do. I pray that all of us, myself and all of us in here, would pray the same prayer, that God, we would run a race as to win. Some of us might not have even started running, but I pray, God, that we would see this and say, I need to run hard after Jesus. And help us, God, to finish the race strong, to finish the race faithful, to finish the race excited and tired because of how hard we ran for you. And so, God, be with us today, even as we go home and think about, what does it look like in my life to be on a missionary journey? Father, we thank you. We love you, Jesus. And we pray this in your holy name.